Thank you very much, Brad. You always have kind of impeccable timing. As I think many of you know, the United Nations General Assembly mandated open-ended working group on disarmament begins its work next Monday. I'm actually flying off to see what's going to happen there. And I suspect that I will be kind of straddling two parallel universes, having just been briefed a couple of weeks ago by Frank Rose, Assistant Secretary, and now you, Brad, on this topic. I'll see a very different set of players in Geneva next week. It's a shame, I must say, editorializing here, that given the need, I think, for this kind of a dialogue, that we're unlikely to see the nuclear weapon states partaking in this discussion, because I think it would be useful to have these views represented so that there actually would be an opportunity for some discussion among parties who have very, very different perspectives. But rather than my saying more at this time, let me open the floor for discussion. I want to particularly encourage our students to ask questions, but I'm not going to preclude those of you who are not students here from raising your hands as well. But I simply want to encourage you to all feel free to ask questions, and I'll try to recognize you as I see hands going up. Please, and Kyle, you could start us off by introducing yourself at the same time that you ask the question.
Hi, my name is Kyle Paludi. I'm a second semester non-proliferation and terrorism studies student. I actually had a question about sort of the future, or maybe lack thereof, of the disarmament kind of initiative. You said you didn't believe it was the right time for further reductions of stockpiles just based on the different relationships we have with the nuclear powers. But how do you feel about the idea of maybe de-alerting some of the nuclear weapons as kind of a stopgap or in between, or how that kind of plays into it?
Well, as I said, I think we've taken the low-hanging fruit off the tree, to use that analogy. On de-alerting in particular, dramatic de-alerting was done in the George H.W. Bush administration. And no subsequent president has seen it as wise to take additional steps. And I'm of that view as well. The argument for additional de-alerting is that by being on alert, things are on a hair trigger, and this is dangerous. And a second argument is that, well, we'd like to do it bilaterally, but if the Russians won't go along, let's do it unilaterally, because that reduces dangers, and it'll put pressure on them to do the same. I would not want to be in a situation where our forces are completely de-alerted and Russians are highly alerted. I don't think there's a realistic prospect of a major Russian strike on the United States, but I don't understand how that would have a positive impact on Putin's view of us and his likely restraint in other areas. So, and I find the hair trigger analogy an odd one. Having firsthand experience of understanding the trigger at the highly classified level, the better analogy is that the gun's got a trigger lock on it. It's in a drawer that's locked. That's in a desk that's locked. That's in an office that's locked. That's in a building that's locked. The problems in the command and control system that have been well written about historically are historical matters. If the real choice is to do it unilaterally or not at all, I choose not at all.
I'm really tempted, seeing some of the other people in the audience, to see whether or not this analogy also holds equally in South Asia. And tomorrow we'll have an interesting presentation on cybersecurity, so we'll see how secure all of these desks and locks in fact are. But that's just a teaser here if you want to respond here, Brad. Some other questions. Please, Julie, I see another one of our students here.
Julie.
Hi, I'm a first year student in the BTS program as well. So I guess my question is kind of a follow-up to that question. How do you see the U.S. government evaluating both de-alerting and dealing with the prospect of going back to the nuclear dyad if they're, after Putin's presidency with a new Russian leader, perhaps somebody more like Medvedev?
Well, your question is about how the U.S. government sees this. It's difficult for anybody to see past Mr. Putin at the moment. Mr. Putin's going to be there a good while longer. And when he goes, it seems unlikely that he will leave behind a free-for-all that will leave open the fundamental questions about Russia's future that he's tried to settle. So, a different Russia would definitely open up the possibility of more fundamental changes in the U.S. nuclear posture. A Russia that was willing to take, the 1/3 reduction I described, I also described as really not changing anything. A Russia that was willing to go the next big step and change some things. But that's a Russia that would have to believe that we were not going to jeopardize their posture as a result of their weakened deterrent in doing that. That Russia I don't see anytime soon. That's not what's just in Mr. Putin's gut, that we're going to exploit their weakness. Moreover, the Russians are well launched on a nuclear modernization program that's not just about their own triad, but it's also about all of their non-strategic weapons, of which they have a great many relative to the number that we have. A lot of their nuclear modernization is driven by concerns about China that have nothing to do with us, that aren't going to go away, they're going to get worse. A lot of their nuclear concerns are about the region they live in and all the intermediate range ballistic missiles pointed at them. Those aren't going to go away. So for me, it's, there was I don't want to say bipartisan optimism, that's a little generous, but in 2007, 8, and 9, I think the Strategic Posture Commission represented a sort of little consensus that there was an opportunity with the Russians to take a step, a big step, that would put us on a qualitatively different strategic military relationship. And that vision seems further and further out of our grasp than it did 7, 8 years ago.
Thanks, Brad. Okay, guys, we are throwing softballs at him now. We have diplomats from around the world here. I'm pleased to call upon those of you who want to challenge some of the fundamentals. I think Brad is well equipped to engage in discussion with you, but I'll first call upon him.
Hi, my name is Rose Tunapia. I'm in BTS second semester student here in this. I was actually wondering, first, you mentioned that NATO countries wanted to keep the nuclear weapons there and protecting them under the U.S. umbrella. But I was actually under the understanding that most of the NATO countries don't really want our weapons there. I believe I've recently read that 2/3 of them don't, particularly Germany, Italy, and Belgium, want us to remove our nuclear weapons. And the populations there have been very anti-U.S. nuclear weapons. I was just wondering I thought that's what I heard you say, so I wanted to...
It is what I said. It's absolutely the case that there's an anti-nuclear element in those populations. That doesn't mean that's what the broad public thinks, firstly. And secondly, that doesn't mean what their elected officials think. The argument I make in the book is that when we started the nuclear consultations in the nuclear posture review period, 2009, and in the NATO context, there were basically 4 views inside NATO about the future of US nuclear weapons in Europe. One was the Westerwelle camp. These are Cold War relics. Why are they still here? They're dangerous, get rid of them. And then there was another camp that said, hey, we just joined the alliance because of the nuclear thing. We don't really think that the French or the Germans are going to come to our defense in a conventional war. We signed up for the nuclear guarantee, said the new members. Then there were some countries on NATO's southern flank that said, yeah, whatever happens with Russia, the real problem is what's happening over there on the other side of the Mediterranean. And this isn't the right time for NATO to send signals of weakness. And then there was a 4th camp that said, I don't have a dog in this fight, you guys sort it out and let me know. And that was frankly the majority. And 2 years later, 3 years later, the Deterrence and Defense Posture Review was conducted, a year-long process, which again, it was NATO's first major nuclear debate since the Cold War. Got almost no attention. That some people say that's because it really wasn't a debate. Well, there were 10 meetings of the North Atlantic Council. There were dozens of ministerial meetings. There were hundreds of meetings in capitals. And at the end, the heads of state said, what happened was of those 4 camps, the one that didn't care went away. And everybody looked at the security environment between 2009 and 2012 and said, it's getting worse, not better. And our commitment to our conventional defense is not paying off. We're not making the investments in NATO's conventional forces that they had committed to make earlier. And we've introduced missile defense into NATO's deterrence posture, but it can't substitute for nuclear weapons in certain specific deterrence functions. So, despite the fact that our publics don't like these weapons, some of our publics, key point, there are 5 or 6 countries with US nuclear weapons in them in the West who would like to be rid of this mission. Boy, do the public opinion polling in the Baltics and the Central European states and the Southern states, you get a very different picture. The point is, the heads of state and government said, we want these to stay, and we're committed to modernizing these capabilities, and we want to take steps to expand NATO's nuclear sharing arrangements. Pretty clear result.
George, I saw you and I saw Nikolai. Is there another hand?
I got a 2-finger action.
Two. Okay. I still think let's take George and then you, and then we have Megan. Did you
All right.
have your hand up as well? Okay.
And I'll go next.
Okay. Okay. Go ahead, George.
Do you foresee any time in the future when we would, our thinking, return to the concept of tactical nuclear weapons, particularly in Asia, reintroducing tactical nuclear weapons?
I think we're going to have a debate about it. We had 3 weeks ago, Denny Blair author an op-ed with a Japanese counterpart. So Denny Blair is the former Pacific Command commander, and a knowledgeable and not a nuclear guy by background at all, saying it's time to revisit this question of U.S. nuclear weapons in Asia. I don't imagine a situation in which there would be U.S. nuclear weapons in Japan. But from Japanese perspective, if they were in Guam, that wouldn't be such a bad thing. From a South Korean perspective, there is a clearly rising national discussion about whether or not South Korea should have nuclear weapons of its own, or whether the reintroduction of U.S. nuclear weapons wouldn't be helpful. There are a handful of Americans who also think that would be a good idea. The case of the Obama administration is that for the current threats that we face there, our ability to deploy into the region in time of crisis nuclear weapons to signal our resolve is already clearly established, and the actual deployment of them there in peacetime would not contribute anything valuable to either the assurance of our allies or the deterrence of North Korea or China. But yes, I think now, tactical weapons. Let me distinguish tactical from non-strategic from strategic. We don't really have any tactical weapons anymore. Why did we have them? We had them because there were 180 armored combat divisions sitting on the eastern side of the NATO-Warsaw Pact divide that were waiting to come through the Fulda Gap, and there was no way we were going to blow them all up with conventional weapons. So we designed weapons that we could use on the battlefield to disrupt the flow of Soviet armored combat divisions. Nowhere is there a need for a tactical weapon like that. But in Europe today, if Russia's nuclear strategy is to escalate with a limited nuclear strike in order to induce us to de-escalate, what we need is the ability to retaliate in the theater in a limited fashion, so that they don't think that there's a step here that they can get away with without the risk of retaliation. For that, the tactical weapon that we would drop in front of they don't have armored combat divisions. Well, they've got 2, I think, at this point. The problem is not defeating Russian conventional forces. There's just sort of theater-level political signaling. So different kinds of weapons. I don't see America going back to tactical nuclear weapons, but I do see us having a debate about whether our commitments to our allies in Europe and Asia are sufficiently met on the basis of the very limited capability we have today to deploy or redeploy nuclear weapons into these regions.
Dr. Sokov.
Well, very thought-provoking, Brad. I expected that, though. As always from you.
Thank you.
That would be very profound and thought-provoking. One short actual comment. Here's another question. The comment is, yeah, I might be wrong, but I think when you discussed the Russian and the Chinese unwillingness to accept insurances that the Obama administration provided, well, sought to provide, well, I think you answered, well, you explained that in the second part of the talk when you discussed the notion of the conventionally superior nuclear power that they needed to face. So,
Right.
yes, basically, you got an explanation right there in your talk.
Right.
I think. So anyway, but the question, you mentioned North Korea more than once. So I was actually trying to find the link, and I could not like at this moment. But I recall you recently published like a short piece on North Korea. That was quite provocative, no? So yes, I wanted maybe.
Well, I don't know how provocative it was, but
I think it was quite provocative. Well,
I mean, shortly.
Okay, thought-provocative.
You may be referring to a piece when I left the Office of the Secretary of Defense almost 2 years ago now. 3 years ago. Time flies. I had the opportunity to do a fellowship at the think tank of the Japanese Ministry of Defense. I'm not a Japan expert. I'd never been to Japan except on brief official visits. This was a really cool, interesting experience to really spend 8 weeks getting inside the heads of the very small community of people in Japan who think about all this kind of stuff. And the paper was called, if this is what you're referring to, Extended Deterrence and Strategic Stability in Northeast Asia. Mm-hmm. And it looked at this, it basically said, why are we talking about this today? Japanese concerns about decoupling and the stability-instability paradox, and about the credibility of U.S. commitments, and Japanese anxiety that America will tell China what China wants to hear. Japan's anxiety is that what China wants to hear is that America accepts a relationship of mutual deterrence with China. We accept a relationship of mutual vulnerability. We accept mutual deterrence. Because if we say that, if that's the message we're trying to send of assurance, the Japanese view is what Beijing will hear is the message of appeasement and thus be emboldened. What they will hear is, okay, America's going to choose to be deterred in a confrontation. And we Japanese are not reassured by this. Why would they be? They shouldn't be. So that paper looks through this issues, because from the Japanese perspective, deterrence and assurance in Northeast Asia is in part about North Korea and in part about China, and they're two very different problems.
I actually hope that you would maybe draw the line to the present time. You mentioned the islands and this whole kind of.
Nikolai, before we go off onto
Yeah.
a very different thing, let me collect some others. I just want, there are lots of people who want to speak here, and so I know that Megan, okay, she's going to go around the room here. Megan, why don't you start? We'll go to the back. We'll go to Francisco. We'll go to Jeffrey Knopf, and then we'll take it from there.
The governor had a hand up.
Okay, I saw it. Go ahead.
Okay, so I'm Megan McCall. This is my last semester as an NPTS student. So during your talk, were you saying, when you brought up Angela Stentz's assessment of the future of US-Russian relations, were you agreeing with what she had evaluated, saying that we can't really fix it, they're just going to be how they are, for the most part?
I don't know about the long term.
Okay.
I'm trying to answer a question that's about, today we face a decision about whether or not to allow our nuclear forces to simply hollow out and disappear over the next 2 decades. If you think nuclear weapons are going to go away in 2 decades, there's a lot you don't spend money on today. If you think they're going to be around for at least 3 decades, then there's some stuff you got to spend money on today. So that's the framework in which I'm looking for answers.
Okay.
I'm pretty sure, I'm pretty sure that the problem we have with Russia today isn't just Mr. Putin. And even if it were just Mr. Putin, the problem he's going to bequeath to us when he goes will be one of his making. And I think there's a certain naivete in American thinking about the world that was evident in the 1990s. That with the end of history, we'd moved out of an era of human history defined by competitions of power among major powers, and we've moved into a new 21st century environment defined by the competition of commercial and sub-state factors. The world's just a hell of a lot more complex than that. And it doesn't mean we face realistic prospects of a war with Russia or China or North Korea. But our failure to have effective deterrence and defense strategies in place only increases the odds that we do have war with them. So I think the next administration a year from now should have a low expectation of its effort to reset the relationship with Russia. I think that there are fundamentally a few things that can be done, but to go to Nikolai's point, the answer to why Russian leaders think the way they do has a lot to do with the way we are. And unless we really want to change, unless we're willing to disband NATO, unless we're willing to withdraw from our power projection role, unless we're willing to let them quash color revolutions, if we're willing to abandon the principle of a Europe whole and free, blah, 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 there's a lot we could do to escape the current problem with Russia. But so long as we're not willing to make those compromises, and I don't believe we should, and I don't believe we're to blame for Mr. Putin's existence, but I think difficult relations among major powers are just a part of the international landscape today. The Strategic Posture Commission said, this is the Perry Schlesinger Commission, said that that really, if we're ever going to get rid of nuclear weapons in the world stage, it's going to require a fundamental transformation in the international political system. They didn't spell out what that might be, but it would certainly require something more fundamental than we've so far achieved in our relations with Russia and China.
I'm really fighting to not ask a question here, so I'm going to give Jeff the opportunity to weigh in here, and then I do think there's some really important issues that we haven't touched upon here, but I'm hopeful maybe Jeff you raise something.
All right, well, thank you so much, Brad, for a incredibly rich talk. And as you were going through, I think I have at least 30 questions I could ask, but I'll limit myself to one, and I will try to follow Bill's admonition to challenge you a little bit.
Good.
So let me put my disarmament hat on for a minute. Your book and your talk essentially are, let's make the affirmative case for continued investment in and a continued role for nuclear weapons. And the kind of obvious logical corollary of that is that we're saying, yes, we need nuclear weapons, then by implication we're saying, no, we don't. We shouldn't go down the path of nuclear disarmament, or at least not now. But I think as I was listening to your argument, the piece that was missing to me is sort of, well, here's what the other side would say, and here's how you would answer it. So I think that there are at least two arguments you could put forward for why the President Obama of the Prague speech had it right, and why we should still be trying to hold to that agenda, right? And one of the things you didn't mention in the talk is the widespread perception of what are the obligations associated with NPT Article 6. And this is just one of those brutal trade-off things where keeping a certain robust nuclear arsenal helps with non-proliferation vis-a-vis a small set of allies who want the extended nuclear deterrence guarantee. But it hurts with non-proliferation vis-a-vis everybody else who's sort of sitting around waiting and saying, we gave up a ton back in 1968, and we've just been waiting for you guys to do Article 6, and you're never budging on this. So, part A of the question is, don't we need to do more to sort of show fidelity and obligation to that? And the second half was clarified for me a little bit in your answer to Kyle's question. Through all of the Cold War nuclear strategy debates, we were always worried about sort of kind of two ideal.
You're getting in 30 questions?
It's almost there. For me, this is short-winded.
Okay, but I have to take notes to remember.
All right, so A is, don't we need to do more about articles? But, so the other half is, we always had kind of two ideal type scenarios in mind of things that could lead to nuclear war, right? One is sort of somebody deliberately chooses to do something, right? And the other was sort of the whole agglomeration of, accidental and inadvertent things that could happen. And when you talked about de-alerting, I think you sort of framed your answer very much in the deliberate scenario, like, well, I don't see how this is going to change Putin's thinking or deliberate behavior. But aren't there also scenarios in which things just go wrong and we find ourselves in a sequence of events where we're losing control, and maybe we don't want to have it be the case that this sequence could end with a nuclear exchange. So those are my two sort of arguments for why I at least keep sort of a few toes in the disarmament camp. I'm just be curious for your responses.
Well, I'm not sure I entirely got the second point, but part of my argument on de-alerting is to make an analogy to the guns of August and the unrolling of the pathway into World War I. I would not, I think, if we ever find ourselves in a real nuclear crisis with Russia, where we're seriously worried about their employment of nuclear weapons, I would not want to be racing to restore a command and control system over deployed nuclear weapons. I think we'd perceive ourselves, we would have uncertainty about the state of Russia's capability, presumably we would calculate they were the precipitators of the crisis, they're ready. I think it would accelerate the pathway. Re-alerting accelerates the pathway to war, not the reverse. First of all, on fealty to the Prague vision, The Prague vision, this is like a Rorschach test. People remember different parts of the Prague vision. The president said very clearly, I want to take practical steps towards the long-term goal. And at the same time, so long as nuclear weapons remain, I will ensure that they remain safe, secure, and effective. I believe my book is right in the mainstream of what the president is. And we were told in the Nuclear Posture Review, distinguish between, we were told by the White House gives presidential study directives at the beginning of an administration telling you what to go do and the scope and rough structure of the analytic work you're going to take on. The president said, let's identify the things we can do now, because the conditions now exist to reduce the role and number of nuclear weapons in U.S. security strategy. So we changed declaratory policy to narrow the role of nuclear weapons in our military strategy, and we negotiated a New START. And then we said the rest depends on creating conditions, specific conditions. Russia joins us in a New START follow-on, China accepts some cap, allies are willing to give up capabilities. Conditions don't exist. Fealty to the Prague vision is paying attention to the conditions. And I believe this is the right dialogue with the disarmament realm. We have a better story than any administration has had about our commitment to disarmament and non-proliferation. And we have invested more political capital and military capital in trying to create the conditions that would allow others to join us in this process. And the case that more unilateral action by the United States can somehow create the conditions that would allow others to join us, what is that case? One case is, it'll put pressure on Mr. Putin. Thank you, I don't find that case persuasive. Second case is, it'll put pressure on the Chinese. I don't find that case persuasive. I think the Chinese joining us in some process is potentially more plausible in the medium term than the Russians, but not a reductions process, a transparency process. So I think we need a remaking of American disarmament diplomacy on making the case that we do have a vision that's not just Never Never Land, global abolition when the lambs lie down with the sheep and the lions and the tigers, but we can actually imagine what the transformation of the international political system is that would make this possible for us. And we can talk about the concrete lessons along the way. And we can put the pressure on the states whose unwillingness to join us in creating conditions is the barrier to further progress in that way. But I think ponying up additional contributions out of the American nuclear arsenal on a unilateral basis to buy disarmament credentials actually works against the long-term objective, because what it leaves the other leaders feeling they're off the hook, because we're the only ones who are going to feel the disarmament heat. And I think that's counterproductive of the long-term goal.
We have a student in the back.
Hi. My name is Nate Taylor. I'm a first year MPTS student. You said earlier that we had three approaches forward, that we had three or some number of approaches forward, and that and the possible need to change the balanced approach that we've had so far, and with the balanced approach, we can destroy the world around, I guess, 100, 150, something like that times over. And so what does an end to a balanced approach look like?
So let me be clear, the balanced approach was what the Strategic Posture Commission recommended. This was the Perry-Schlesinger Commission, which by that they meant that in facing a world various nuclear dangers, nuclear risks, and nuclear threats. We would use both political tools like arms control and disarmament and non-proliferation to try to reduce and eliminate those dangers and threats. But so long as dangers and threats remain, we will ensure that we have military means available to us to deter those threats. That's what they meant by the balanced approach. And their argument was this is the tradition of American nuclear policy since the beginning of the nuclear era, which I would argue is a gross generalization is correct. I'm one of those who's skeptical about statements that we can destroy the world 1,000 times over. I mean, if there was a time when we had 35,000 nuclear weapons. With 1550, I don't want to say that's a little. It's still a lot of nuclear weapons. But this, and this was one of the big debates in the nuclear posture review. How much does it take to deter? The Chinese answer is one. They just have to be confident that one's going to get through in retaliation. A big one. They make big ones. And if they came close to Los Angeles would be dust. That's enough to deter America in their assessment, because we're a casualty-averse society, blah, blah, blah. That's not the Russian calculus at all. The Russian calculus is they need to be able to deliver hundreds on us for us to calculate that the risks aren't worth running.
50.
And the problem in the real policy world is where's the answer to that question? How do you know the answer to that question? Who's got the answer to that question? Nobody has an answer to that question. In the policy world, you have these fundamental questions you have to make a choice about, even if you can't validate the answer somehow. So the United States, our tradition of thinking about this is, we don't know how many it might take to deter. It might only take the threat of one to deter any aggression by any of these three states. But what we can see is that Russia has the capability and apparently the thinking about hundreds. And do we want to place our bet in a China-like strategy for America? And the answer is no. We have so far chosen not to run that risk. One, because we're really not sure it would work, that Mr. Putin would really be persuaded by the threat of 1 or 2 or 50. And secondly, it offends the commitment we've made. Unlike the other nuclear weapon states, we accepted the ruling of the International Court of Justice and said that our nuclear deterrence planning, to the best of our possible ability, would be consistent with the requirements of proportionality and discrimination. We're not going to stand up and say our nuclear strategy is to drop a couple of big bombs on Russian or Chinese cities and blow away their societies. That's our deterrence strategy. That's not morally acceptable to our political class. So this is a barrier to deep reductions, but it's a fact.
Claudio, why didn't I?
Basically, this is in the same line with the previous question, because US...
You would identify yourself too, Claudio.
My name is Claudio, I am Chilean diplomat.
Thank you.
United States have an undisputable supremacy in conventional weapons. But the question is back in the same line, because if you have that supremacy, on the other hand, I believe there is still, a long way from 5,000 nuclear weapons to some, point in which the ability of the United States to maintain a, credible deterrence is still possible. And this is the space, obviously, for further reduction, and that is basically the point. Because you said it is not possible for further reduction, but our perception is still there is some room for further reduction. If you have for one side, supremacy in conventional weapons, and for the other side, 5,000 nuclear weapons, basically. And one additional thing, you see any positive prospect for the ratification of CTT in the near future?
The near future.
Yeah,
No,
no way.
the political conditions don't exist. Let me invite you to think about the Geneva Protocol of 1925, which was a ban on the use of chemical and bacteriological agents, which the United States did not ratify for 50 years. We were bound by it. We didn't violate a commitment we didn't accept under the treaty. In World War II, we might have. So, I would not predict that the CTBT is going away anytime soon. I think a return to testing by any of the nuclear weapon states is unlikely. The first to return will not be the United States, if it ever happens. Is this the best outcome? No. But it's a political fact that we don't have support in the Republican Party for this endeavor. On the first point,
Do we have support at Livermore National Laboratory?
I don't speak, I'm not here to speak on behalf of the Livermore National Laboratory. The technical community, you know, there were basically two very big questions at the time of the ratification review. Was stockpile stewardship going to work or not? And was this really going to make a difference in terms of being a barrier to nuclear weapons development by other states? Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory has a clear answer to the first, which is that stockpile stewardship has been proven to work. And that we have the technical means today and a track record of ensuring that these aging weapons remain viable and don't need to test them. So there's a Livermore answer. Undisputable supremacy. BS. Where do we have undisputable supremacy? In the Baltic states, the RAND analysis that came out 2 months ago says that Mr. Putin, who boasted that he could have his forces in 3 NATO capitals in 50 hours, the RAND study said he was off by 10 hours. It's 60. We don't have conventional supremacy in Europe. We certainly don't have it in Northern Europe. Do we have conventional supremacy on the Korean Peninsula? Supremacy measured how? Do we have the conventional means to prevent the North from incinerating Seoul with artillery fire?
But the nuclear deterrence war in that case?
Not for the, well, it might have a role in deterring the North Korean use of 19,000 artillery tubes against Seoul, the southern capital. The conventional supremacy of the United States is true only if you give us a lot of time to bring things from long distances. Saddam's most fundamental mistake was he let us go first in the war. We had 6 months to do Desert Storm. Now, the forces that we did Desert Storm with, all gone today. They all came out of NATO Europe. They've been disbanded. Where is our conventional? This image of conventional supremacy of the United States, it's true if you give us a lot of time and all of the access we need to bases in the region to get things there. If you can create the conditions where our allies don't want to support us, let me give you an example. Northeast Asia. The conventional defense of South Korea would be conducted not with just the locally available forces, but there are 8 bases in Japan flying the United Nations flag today. The dispatch of UN forces from those bases requires the approval of the Japanese Prime Minister. Little known fact. In the 1950s, that was a foregone conclusion. There was no risk to Japan of a war on the Korean Peninsula. Kim Jong-un has made it very clear, repeatedly, if there is ever a war on the Korean Peninsula, the first target of North Korea's nuclear weapons is not Seoul, it's not San Francisco, it's Japan. Why? Well, he wants to give the Japanese Prime Minister every reason to say no. Can the conventional defense of South Korea be done without those forces? No. Are we conventionally superior? No. Are we conventionally superior in the Persian Gulf? Where are we conventionally superior? This is, yes, it's true. If you give us 6 months, 25 years ago, when we had all of those forces to deploy, now we need more than 6 months. But I'm not saying we rely on nuclear weapons as compensation for conventional weakness. That's what we did in the 1950s. But I do think these three actors can convince themselves that the conventional forces that we have available locally are not sufficient to prevent them from achieving a fait accompli, that we would then have to decide whether or not we really want to reverse at high cost. And our allies would have to decide whether they want to stay with us in that fight. On 5,000 nuclear weapons, the deployed number of strategic offensive weapons is 1,550, or it will be in 2018 when we've fulfilled our New START implementation plan. The extra 3,500 or so are there because these are old. As I said, the newest went in 1989. Every American president since the Cold War has said, let's get rid of those spares. How are we going to do that? By having new ones that you don't have to worry about. Right now we have to worry about if a problem develops because of aging in one of these weapons. The whole nuclear submarine force may be declared in one day not technically viable. And so you better have, if you believe in strategic stability, you better have some ability to compensate by putting additional bombs back on bombers or warheads on ICBMs or something like that. So those extra 3,500 are a reflection of the fact that we haven't been willing to produce replacement warheads that are reliable, and we haven't been willing to invest in an infrastructure that could do so quickly if we needed to. So they are a hedge. And I think we would give up that hedge at great risk until we have made those investments in the nuclear weapons complex.
Let me tell you where we stand in terms of the speaking, or the questioners. And then we'll have to wrap up probably within another 10 or 15 minutes. So I'm going to collect the questions or comments and then give Brad a chance to respond. And so I'm going to call upon Alex, Wade, Francisco, Avner, and if any time is left, I may ask a question or make a comment as well here. So if we could proceed in that order now, let's take advantage of the time that we have left. Alex, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm Alex. I'm here for the semester. I'm an undergrad studying in the NPTS department, and you really kind of just answered my question. I was wondering about your inclusion of North Korea in the three countries that we need to deter against, considering their technological inferiority in all manner of military things. They have a lot of troops, but they don't really have the ability to use nuclear weapons at the moment. And so I was wondering if you think there's any room for replacing nuclear deterrence, especially in the Korean Peninsula, with conventional forces. But you just basically...
I gave you a hint.
So take that, okay. I may be deviating from my list here, Wade, but do you want to ask a question, then I'll have Francisco and then Avner.
Sure.
You want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, Wade Huntley. I'm over at the Naval Postgraduate School. I wanted to kind of circle back to where you began. Talking about the dichotomy in the debate on these issues, reaching back to the 80s, persisting today, signified by the Paris-Schlesinger agreement on what they couldn't agree on. But Paris-Schlesinger also signifies a certain level of understanding of the nature of the debate, the issue, the underlying questions. Today, we have the specter of a leading presidential candidate who cannot even recognize what the nuclear triad is, let alone address the questions, his question that deals with the issues you're raising. So my question is, what is your level of confidence that the coming discourse, regardless of who's elected, will even be able to remain at the meager level of bipolar dysfunction?
Okay, Francisco.
Hi, thank you for the talk. I'm Francisco Parada. I'm a second semester student here at the MPTS program. Following the question close to Claudio, you made it very clear the case that Russia is not cooperating, and the nuclear triad, taking one leg out of the nuclear triad wouldn't work, the alerting wouldn't work. Do you consider an option, as Claudio mentioned, as ratifying the CTBT and making a commitment in outer space to bring China and Russia to the table to negotiate possible disarmament talks?
Okay, Abner.
Yeah, Brad, this is kind of follow-up to what Jeff was saying, that is to say the legacy of Prague. I mean, you gave a very nice, synchronized kind of post-mortem why the whole 2007, 2008 horseman Prague kind of thing became irrelevant and was gone. As you know, there are other narratives. Some narratives said that actually the president was a personal vision, but it was easier for him to have people like you as a coordinator and your group to undermine deliberately or less deliberately, but essentially he was never ready to fight for his vision. So you came with your sense of realism and it was a way to get it out. Or that you actually never had a desire to fight for that, and you, the realist, actually just sabotaged the vision and just let it go and you didn't fight it. I recall Joe so angry at your group after the first you invited people from NGOs, and he said they're undermining the president's vision. I mean, these people, it was such outrageous. So there are various kind of ways to make that kind of history. It's a long story, and maybe we'll have some other time to wait to do it slowly. But the way to put it just on Russia and just on the condition that we didn't view, it's too easy the way that you put it in response to Jeff. That's all what I want to say. The story is more complicated than that, at least from my perspective.
Brad, let me ask. This is somewhat facetious, but there's an element of I think a realist kind of perspective in the question. It would be intriguing if you were to think of your book as the first in a series. And if you were to substitute for the US, the DPRK, the Russian Federation, India, Pakistan, Israel, and you could kind of continue this on. I'm curious, how much would you have to change? I mean, the arguments that you make, it seemed to me, without a great deal of alteration, could find substantial, it would resonate substantially in many other capitals. I think perhaps the threat perceptions are different, but I suspect in a way, if this were to be translated, it would have considerable support in many of the existing nuclear weapon states as well as many others. And that I think I find troubling if my assumption is correct here, because I think we tend, I guess I'm looking at this in particular from a Russian, trying to look at it from a Russian perspective, and I don't think it would be that difficult if one were to try to make a case, as you have, rather persuasively for the United States. And then I ask myself, where does that leave us in terms of the future of nuclear weapons? It's not a reassuring position, I would say. So I'm just kind of curious the extent to which you see this as a kind of a unique argument, which really only stands for the United States, whether many of your arguments are transferable to other countries as well.
Well, that's an excellent, and they're all good questions. Thank you. And in the couple of minutes or so I have left, First of all, on North Korea, I wouldn't downplay North Korea's ability to utilize nuclear weapons, employ nuclear weapons. You know, what's the Joel Witt project? North, sorry, 38 North, thank you. Predicts that by 2020 they'll have 100 deployed nuclear weapons. We can dispute whether they have the means now to strike the United States with them or not. And there are contradictory expert views on that. There is no dispute about their ability to strike their regional neighbors with nuclear weapons today. And moreover, it's not really about employing the weapons, it's about credibly threatening to employ them. It's about coercion and blackmail and brinksmanship. And they already have the tools for that vis-a-vis their regional neighbors. This is what Japan and South Korea are reacting to, and also China. Sort of aghast, China is, at the new games being played by North Korea under their own nuclear umbrella. So I don't share the opening proposition in your question that because North Korea might not be capable of exploiting these new nuclear tools in some way that there's a possibility of shifting to conventional deterrence. You know, conventional deterrence is also itself the conventional defense of South Korea is part of why North Korea has nuclear weapons. And the stronger the conventional forces on the southern part of the peninsula, the more it fears regime removal strategies by the South. So, I mean, this is also the case with Russia and China. Russia and China are highly motivated by the developments in America's conventional military capabilities, not its nuclear capabilities. So, how do we create the conditions that allow them to reduce their reliance on nuclear weapons? Well, reduce, maybe. Eliminate their reliance on nuclear weapons? Very, very hard for me to imagine. The coming discourse, bipolar dysfunction. One thing that really strikes me about this is a guy who tried to avoid this debate for 20 years and has now gotten mired in it, is that it's not a very broad debate anymore. And in fact, we've had a measure of bipartisanship, despite Joe Cirincione's narrative that we abandon the president or undermine the president. Joe Cirencione hated the Strategic Posture Commission, by the way, as providing just the wrong advice to the president. Every president has to choose what they want to get done. Are you willing to just tilt at windmills, say the right stuff that pleases your base, and go down to defeat? Or are you going to be pragmatic and get business done? And this is what the extremes in the parties will always fault the moderates in the party for doing. But the moderates in the parties are usually the one who they are the ones who get things done because of their ability to find some consensus. Despite this period that I've described of deep bipolar dysfunction, we gained Senate support for New START, which was not all obvious that was going to happen. And we have each year increased funding for nuclear modernization because that was necessary to do. We got Republicans and Democrats, majorities from neither party, but sufficient to get that done. So we don't have a bipartisan consensus. What we have is a workable governing agreement among key stakeholders within both parties. I think that's likely to continue unless somebody comes in with a real gusto for new nuclear weapons or with a decision to move the whole nuclear enterprise to let it collapse, to put it into curatorship and just let age take over. If those things happen, the little agreement we've got will tear apart. So that's an optimistic view. I too watched the election debates and just worried. But you know, I'm sure we all have the same reaction. I've answered the CTBT question, and I think on outer space, it's difficult for me to see that the approach that the Russians and Chinese have set out so far is one that's in our interest. Because it largely seems to be about restraint on us and not on them. And it largely seems to be unverifiable and a wave of the hand and say that doesn't matter. But we'll see how that looks to all three capitals as the competition for counter space capabilities accelerates. And the perception of the possibility of mistakes in space, miscalculation, and unwanted escalation in conflict may fuel some new interest there. But I don't see that as happening in the short term. To Abner's question, competing narratives. I mean, I've already half answered the question, but President Obama, to the disappointment of his base in many ways, turned out to be a pragmatic guy. It's the only way he got healthcare done. And I think the healthcare experience was a powerful one in the president's approach to his other agenda. He had to compromise on some fundamentals to get healthcare passed. And then he saw that this was the only way he was going to get anything done for a while, and then he didn't see much hope of getting anything done that required legislative action. Nuclear business requires legislative action. The New START Treaty required ratification by the Senate. And nuclear force modernization requires authorization and appropriation. So he's been pragmatic, and the hardliners can only explain that by his lack of balls. I mean, Steve Pfeiffer, a friend of the administration, wrote his Washington Quarterly article in which he said the disappointing Obama nuclear legacy has to do with 3 R's: Russians, Republicans, and reluctance. And there were things that the president was reluctant to do in the nuclear area that he should have done. And for Steve, those were get nuclear weapons out of Europe. Who cares what the Allies think? Get nuclear weapons out. Implement New START 2 years earlier. I don't know why that was a big thing, and I can't remember his third thing. This is always the fundamental choice for a president. Do I do what's appealing to my base, or do I get some business done? And President Obama chose to get some business done in this area, and I think that was the right choice. Bill's question is a great one and a great closing note. The first thing that leaps out at me is no other country has to think about extended deterrence. You know, Russia and the Chinese have one ally, but they don't extend nuclear deterrence to it. They're worried about getting sucked into a nuclear catastrophe that it creates. The Russians have a couple of allies and hint periodically about an extended deterrent role there. But fundamentally, extended deterrence and the assurance of our allies is a very prominent part of our nuclear strategy in a way that it's not for other nuclear armed states. Secondly, I think all nuclear states have to satisfy themselves that if they're ever really in a pinch, they can use these things in a manner that gets them out of the pinch safely. And they in part have to convince themselves that they can go first and it'll work out okay. We don't have a nuclear escalation to de-escalate strategy, but in a sense we do. I mean, we have to convince ourselves that if we go first, which our strategy permits us to do, that we won't end up in catastrophe, that we'll end up in the other side having decided, oops, I miscalculated, I'm going to back down. So I think that there are some common problems in nuclear deterrence strategy that any nuclear armed state faces. But I think your basic pessimistic take is on the mark. which is to say that I don't see any, this is one of my main points, none of the nuclear armed states today sees the conditions as ripe for becoming unnuclear armed. And in fact, we're the only nuclear armed state that sees and desires a specific concrete further reduction. And solving that problem has something to do with solving the problems in the interstate system for which nuclear weapons are relevant. My perception is that the disarmament community, that the international humanitarian consequences movement comes directly at nuclear weapons as the problem, rather than as the manifestation of a problem. And as long as we only try and strip away nuclear weapons from a security environment in which states feel threatened and insecure, we're only going to magnify the perception of threat and insecurity. So we have to somehow deal with the more fundamental security perceptions.
Brad, I think, first of all, let me thank you very much for truly fascinating, provocative, and stimulating presentation. The fact that we have so many of the audience members still here 2 hours after we started, as we approach 6 p.m. is, I think, really a testament to their interest in the subject matter and the manner in which you made the presentation. So I hope it's not another 2 years before we have you back here.
Thank you.
Please join me in thanking Dr. Brown.